This is an episode of Unconfined, the podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. Unconfined is a podcast about industrial food animal production and its emerging alternatives. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are me, Christine Grillo, and Tom Philpott. Paulette O'Leary is our producer, and Natalie Woodwright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future.
Welcome to the latest episode of Unconfined. And I feel like I've been saying we were having a special episode for almost every one for a while now, but this one is actually an extra special one. We have one of my heroes in our field today, and that is Marion Nestle. Anyone listening to this podcast really doesn't need an introduction to Marion, but she is the Paulette Godard Professor of Nutrition Emerita and also Food Studies and Public Health at New York University. She is, I believe you can correct me, Marion, but I think you're the founder of the Masters in Food Studies at NYU. Is that correct?
Well, actually, it's even our department found in Food Studies.
Yeah. Very first Food Studies department in America. And what year was that?
1996.
1996. Founded this Food Studies program and is the author or co-author of 15 books. Marion, welcome to Unconfined Podcast.
Oh, glad to be here.
Now, we're going to talk in this conversation about one of the themes of your work going back to the very beginning, I think, and that is sort of industry influence on nutrition research. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, how you got into food studies. I also want to hear about where you grew up. And I just want to say that in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was a frustrated business journalist in New York City, trying to figure out how to get into writing about food in a way that wasn't just about delicious food, but about the whole food system. And your book, Food Politics, came out in 2002 and really sort of presented, sort of organized it as a topic for me. And about that time, there was a couple of points when I almost enrolled in the program and went there. I was too scared to meet you, Marion, but I met a couple of people at a couple of your colleagues and visited a couple of classes and came very close to applying for the program. So I wonder if you can talk us through a little bit just how it is you had the idea of launching a food studies program. How did you get into the field? And also talk a little bit about your background and where you grew up and things like that.
Quick biography. I grew up in New York City. I moved to California. I went to Berkeley. All my degrees are from Berkeley. I have a doctorate in molecular biology, a master's in public health, everything from Berkeley. I worked for the government for 2 years during the Reagan administration as the editor of the Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health. And I went to NYU right after that. My first teaching job was earlier than that at Brandeis University, where I taught in the biology department and was handed a nutrition course to teach. It was like falling in love. I've never looked back. And when I got to NYU, I went there as chair of the Department of Home Economics. Hard to believe that there were still home economics departments, but that's when I was chairing. And I had been given the mandate to bring that department into the 20th, if not the 21st century.
Right. So we're talking still like early 90s?
That was late 80s, early 90s. And in the early 1990s, I was hanging around with a group in New York food people called Old Ways Preservation and Exchange Trust, a think tank on food issues. And they held conferences where they brought together academics, cooks, chefs, food writers, and other people interested in food. So I was meeting all these food people, very exciting. The university was trying to improve and it wanted to consolidate its hotel programs. My department had a hotel program. They wanted it. They were taking it away. The hotel program brought in $1 million a year in tuition. They wanted to know what I was going to do to make up that $1 million in tuition.
Wow.
And I said, how about food studies? And it just came off the top of my head because I had been dealing with all these food people who were telling me how much they wanted to know about the history and culture of food.
Yeah, I remember the Old Ways Food Alliance, and it was very productive in
extraordinarily productive. And I met the most amazing people, and it was life changing in a lot of ways. And so when the dean asked me what I was going to do, I said, how about food studies? She said, what's that? And I managed to come up with some kind of answer. And she said, I think I could get that for you. And so we went from concept to state approval in less than a year, a record-breaking time at a university. I had plenty of help with it. I had our consultants helping me and an advisory committee, and they were all doing really great things. Yeah, I mean, the thing that made the program was that the New York Times wrote about it the week after the state approved it. So there was in the food section of the New York Times an announcement of the creation of this program. And we had people in our office that afternoon holding up the clipping saying, I've waited all my life for this program. So we had a class in the fall, a class from then on. And the first question everybody asked was, what's food studies? What is it? And we don't get asked that question anymore. We were doing, there was a gastronomy program at Boston University, but the term food studies worked much better at NYU. It has lots of programs that end with the word studies. And we didn't realize that we were creating a movement. There are now 60 or 70 programs throughout the country of one kind or another. But we were very lucky in that all the cards played at the same time and we were able to do it. And everybody felt so sorry for us for loss of that program that the university was very kind.
Now, you took your own personal work in a very particular direction, and that was sort of training your critical eye and your sort of scientific background on what the food industry was producing and feeding the United States. How did you get into that particular topic?
Well, there's a turning point for that too, a very precise one. I went to a meeting at the National Cancer Institute in the early 1990s. And it was a meeting on behavioral causes of cancer. And the two behaviors that were looked at that meeting were diet and cigarette smoking. And I knew that cigarette smoking caused cancer. I really did. But I had never heard the physicians and scientists who were doing research on smoking and cancer talk about it. And I heard one talk after another, including slide talks on marketing of cigarettes to adults and to children. And the slide talk about marketing cigarettes to kids was particularly life-changing because I knew that cigarette companies marketed to kids. I really did, but I had never paid attention to it. And slide after slide after slide showed Joe Camel advertisements in places where kids were. And I had seen Joe Camel advertisements, I never paid any attention to them. They
Yeah.
were absolutely ubiquitous. They were part of the landscape.
Yep.
And I walked out of that meeting thinking, we need to be doing this for Coca-Cola. This
Right.
is exactly what Coca-Cola is doing, and I need to start paying attention to this. So I did. And whenever I traveled, I would take photographs of Coke and Pepsi and McDonald's advertisements and marketing in ways that I had never noticed before. And I had a whole collection of slides. I started writing articles about the way in which food companies marketed in ways that people didn't notice, things other than advertising on television. And by the time the late 1990s came around, I had quite a collection of these articles. And I had been trained in molecular biology where books don't count. Nobody's interested in books because they're secondary analyses. And molecular biology prized basic fundamental research that you did yourself, and articles on that. And so I didn't quite get the whole book idea, but by the late 1990s, I could see that NYU highly valued books, and humanities and social science approach. And I thought I had enough articles to put together in a book. And that's where Food Politics came from. And also Save Food, the book that came out a year later.
Yeah. And these are really just sort of groundbreaking books, sort of genre defining books. And I think, kind of maybe before you started your work on sort of junk food advertising to kids, it was just the air we breathed. We just expected it. And you made it into this thing that, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Why are we allowing this? And there have been significant changes. The companies have had to adjust themselves to these critiques, right? There's no regulation exactly, but the companies have had to respond to the critiques of the way they market junk food to kids.
Well, not only is there no regulation, but they're not allowed to be regulations. In 1980 or so, when Reagan came in, Congress passed a bill saying, "Thou shalt not restrict marketing to children." It's a First Amendment issue. The head of the Federal Trade Commission was fired, and because he had tried to restrict television advertising to children to foods that met certain nutrition criteria. They weren't even very stringent nutrition criteria. And he had his head handed to him on a platter. And Congress passed that law. So the food companies have argued that they have First Amendment rights to sell junk food to kids and in any way they want to. And I think the First Amendment issue is astonishing because I cannot believe that the founding fathers intended the First Amendment to permit marketing of highly processed foods to kids. But that's how the courts have interpreted it. The FDA has given up on it. And we'll see what RFK Jr. does if he gets confirmed.
Right. Okay, well, let's transition into one of the themes of your work from that time up to today. One thing I left out of the introduction is that you run a blog regularly updated that you've been updating for years and years called Food Politics itself. So if you Google Marion Nestle and Food Politics blog, you'll find it. And one of the running themes of your blog is you sort of highlight whenever one crosses your desk, an industry-funded study, and you sort of break it down and tell us, what the implications are, where the biases are in the study. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, take a step back from this problem, and what would an ideal way of funding nutrition research be versus the system that we have now, where there's a lot of industry influence? Like, what would the ideal be?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that industry funding influences research. I can look at the title of a study and guess who paid for it. If I know who paid for a study, I can guess what the outcome is. There's something wrong with that. And and there's a huge body of research literature that shows that industry funding influences the outcome of research. But more than that, the recipients of the funding didn't intend to be influenced. They don't believe that the funding influences them, and they deny that there's an influence. They just don't see it because it's at a subconscious level. And so I wrote a book about that, Unsavory Truth, how the food industry, how food companies skew the science of what we eat. And I post on my blog, usually on Mondays, some example that I run across, each one more hilarious than the next, because they're so predictable. And it's interesting. The one that I did this week is on the Lancet Commission, defining obesity as a disease. And this was a very, very important commission that did a very important piece of work. And the conflicts of interest statement goes on for 2 pages in very tiny print. Practically everybody connected with this has some kind of financial association with one of the drug companies that produces drugs that are treating obesity, very important drugs, doing very important work. And I saw it post. This was sent to me by a reader, and I posted something about it this week. And I've just received a very polite message from the chair of the Lancet Commission saying, but we're just doing science. Why aren't you talking about the science?
Right.
Which is what everybody says.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, let's I want to come back to that, but let's talk a little bit about the ways that the funding of research has an influence, because it is, like you say, it's not that these scientists are taking bribes and doing what their sponsors tell them, but there's this influence about the questions that get asked, the way the studies are shaped. Talk a little bit about this sort of subtle guiding of results.
Again, there's a huge research literature on this.
Yeah.
And this research shows, most of it done on pharmaceutical drugs. You know, with the drug industry, you can show that drug funding of a physician, you know, giving a physician a dinner, giving a physician a pad of paper with a prescription pad with a drug logo on it and a pen with a drug logo on it will influence that physician to prescribe the brand name drug rather than a generic, and never realize it.
Yeah.
You know, it occurs at a completely unconscious level. But the research shows that the influence is not on the conduct of the science. The studies are conducted according to very high scientific standards. Where the influence takes place is in the way the research question is designed or in the interpretation of the research. It's easier to discuss the interpretation issue because if a study comes out basically with null results, you didn't find any difference one way or the other, the study will be interpreted as showing that whatever it is you're looking at could have produced a beneficial result.
Right.
That's the interpretation bias. The question bias is more complicated, but it's not difficult to design studies to give you the answer that you want. For example, I get letters all the time from trade associations saying, we've got this amount of money and we're interested in proposals for studies that will demonstrate the benefit of our product for heart disease, cognition, prevention of whatever, you know, behaviors in children, whatever the benefit is. They're not going to fund anything that's not likely to show a benefit.
Right.
You know, they're going to fund studies that are going to give them the answer they want. And all of this is done on a level of that's not particularly conscious. It makes it very difficult to talk about.
Now, what about, so in the system that we have where we are bombarded with a lot of research that when you peel back the curtain, as you do every week, shows that there's industry funding behind it, like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association is stepping in to do a study on, hey, does, consistent beef consumption increase heart disease risk? And so, you had one a couple of weeks ago about this and just sort of the subtle biases at work there. What about, isn't there a role for public funding? So that is an interesting question. Does beef increase heart attack risk? What if there were public funding and so money was going out to researchers to do studies on important topics like that, but the National Cattlemen's Beef Association didn't have their wallet out to fund it? Wouldn't that be better?
Now I remember what your question was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, there's a way to do this. Okay. NIH is interested in funding precision nutrition, which is very individualized and doesn't have much to do with public health. It's not interested in public health.
Right.
So there's not a whole lot of public NIH money for these kinds of things. So researchers say, where are we supposed to get funding for our studies? And here come food companies eager to fund university research. So I do think that there's a way to do this so that the bias is removed. And that is food companies donate to a common fund. And that common fund is distributed by a third-party agency, and it puts out requests for proposals, and it decides which proposals to fund. And all the researcher knows is that a whole bunch of food companies, not a single one, had contributed to this. It was a food industry pool. I think that would work. When I talk to food companies about it, they're not the slightest bit interested.
Why would they? Yeah.
Because the reason that they're funding research is to get the answers they want.
Yeah. And, all of a sudden in a situation like that, these companies that are very free spending with research would be like, oh, no, we need to cut costs. We can't afford to fund research all of a sudden.
No, they're not the slightest bit interested in something like that.
And do we have a demonstrated is there like a downward trend in NIH or other federal funding for sort of general nutrition research? Is there in the Reagan administration, it started to go down and industry has taken over? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, there's a trend. But the real point, I think, is that NIH has said it's interested in precision nutrition.
That is so ridiculous.
Aimed at individuals, looking at individual genetic components of people and designing diets that are going. To me, it's not public health.
Yeah.
Or they're interested in food as medicine, whatever that means and however that works. But there isn't going to be a huge investment in the kinds of questions that eaters want to know the answers to. Is meat good or bad for me? Are plant-based meats better than regular meats? Those kinds of questions, which are very, very difficult to answer. And let me say, nobody can possibly overestimate the difficulty of nutrition research enough. Nutrition research is really, really difficult. And the most intellectually challenging question in nutrition research is, what do people eat? Everybody eats enormously varied diets. The diets of individuals from day to day are more varied than the diets of one person and another. Really difficult, unless you're Kevin Hall at NIH locking people up in a metabolic ward and feeding them defined diets. You have no idea what people are eating.
And you're referring to this really incredible Kevin Hall study that's gotten a lot of attention. I think I wrote about it when it came out a few years ago, where he isolated two groups of people literally in a facility and fed them diets and came to some startling conclusions about ultra-processed foods that we can talk about in a second. But just to say, that kind of research is enormously expensive, right?
Enormously. And NIH is not very interested in funding it. They keep cutting his funding.
Amazing.
Well, and I think he's doing some of the most important work of anybody who's working in nutrition.
Yeah,
Because he's got these people locked up that can't lie or cheat.
yeah. And, and a lot of our, there's a lot of really important nutrition research that's done on this sort of national nurses study where you get a group of people self-reporting what they ate, and it's important stuff, but also self-reporting is infamously unreliable, right?
You roll your eyes.
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, they underreport calories. So that tells you they don't report eating enough calories to maintain the weights that they are. And so that tells you that there's a flaw in there. And what you don't know is whether the underreporting is systematic. They underreport everything across the board, or whether they're underreporting what they think they're not supposed to be eating, and over-reporting what they think they are supposed to be eating. It's just very, very hard to know. The people who do those studies, which I agree are very important studies for what they tell you, but they have to be taken with a certain amount of skepticism. The people who do those studies say that the numbers account for it, but I don't know whether that's true or not.
Yeah, they try to account for everything, but it's really, really difficult, and it's not an exact science. Now,
so I want everybody locked up, except that you can't lock people up for very long.
Yeah, a couple weeks.
The big complaint is that these studies don't go on long enough. So I think everybody in nutrition should be arguing for more money for those studies.
Yeah.
But I'm not hearing much of that from the nutrition community.
Right. And we're in a political situation where it's hard to imagine more, basic research funding coming out of Congress anytime soon.
Well, I don't know. This is the first time I've ever heard about people talking about chronic disease
it's
at
true.
This level. Maybe they'll do something.
We do have Robert F. Kennedy probably coming in to lead Health and Human Services, and there's a lot of, terrible issues around that, including his vaccine hesitancy and skepticism. But potentially, he could be a voice for this kind of research.
He sounds just like me on a lot of issues. He wants ultra-processed foods out of schools. He wants mercury out of fish. He wants color additives out of cereals. Okay. Sure. We'll see.
So, Marion, I would be remiss that probably the biggest sort of buzzword in your field right now is ultra-processed foods, which this group of researchers out of Brazil sort of came up with this kind of with this concept. And do you think it's a useful heuristic to look at things, ultra-processed versus not ultra-processed? What do you think about it?
Well, I think it's enormously important. And look what it's done. It was a concept that was developed in 2009. Since then, there have been more than 1,000 studies relating ultra-processed foods to health outcome. And all the studies are universally across the board show that eating a diet high in ultra-processed foods raises the risk for obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, overall mortality, and a lot of other problems. And then you have Kevin Hall's studies, which show that ultra-processed foods induce people to eat more calories. I don't think you need to know any more than that. That's enough. Because it wasn't just more calories, it was 500 calories a day more, an enormous number. And people gained a pound a week, which is exactly what you would predict for 500 calories a day. The study has now been repeated by Hall and by another group, and it repeats. And yes, the argument is it's only for a couple of weeks, but, they gained weight in a couple of weeks. So enormously important result. And partly and I'm astonished by the level of pushback against it, not only from the food industry, which I would expect to push back because ultra-processed products are among the most profitable in the supermarket. I mean, they're the big money makers. But there's also an enormous pushback from segments of the nutrition community, which are attacking it for the margins, that there are a few products that fall under the category and definition of ultra processed that probably aren't so terrible if you look at them separately. But I think those people ought to be arguing for more money for Kevin Hall's studies. You think his studies are too short? Get the money to let him do longer studies.
Yeah. And we can haggle at the margins over what is an ultra processed food and what's not. That's not a fundamental problem.
Yeah, I don't find it an interesting question at the margin. I don't care. And the margins are very narrow. Whole wheat bread, commercial whole wheat bread, sugar sweetened yogurt, plant-based meats. That's it.
Yeah.
Those are the marginal foods. The exceptions don't defeat the rule here.
Yeah. Now, to wrap up our conversation, you have documented for so long this sort of blitz of constant dietary information, this study and that study saying eat this and don't eat that. And it feels, as you well know, it feels to a lot of people out there, sort of civilians who aren't as immersed in it as we are, that it's just so complicated. I can't deal with it. And I think that's part of the strategy of sort of flooding the zone with research, that it just makes it seem like, I can't listen to advice because it's so all over the place. But actually, Marion, it's pretty simple. Can you just give us, from your years of studying this topic, what are a few simple rules that, apart from this blizzard of, meat doesn't cause cardiovascular disease, says the meat industry, just give us a few rules for dietary choices that are just common sense.
Well, I'm a big fan of Michael Pollan's mantra, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. It's so simple that he can do it in 7 words. There are only a couple of things that have to sort of explain that. One is, by food, he means not ultra-processed foods.
Yeah.
Relatively unprocessed foods. And then the other part of that would be, if you're worried about weight loss, you shouldn't drink sugar sweetened beverages. Really, if there's one no, it's sugar sweetened beverages. Sugars and nothing else. But it's simple. And I think eat food, not too much, mostly plants doesn't mean totally plants. It's an omnivore's diet, but with enormous room for flavor and pleasure and deliciousness and eating out and breaking the rules occasionally. I think eating is really simple. It's how I eat. I would never suggest to anybody else that they do something that I'm not willing to do. I eat plenty of junk food. I like it a lot. I just don't eat too much of it.
Yeah, just try to limit it. And if you do that, you're probably going to have pretty decent health outcomes and avoid some really bad stuff. And you don't have to read the latest study and do whatever they say. Although I agree with you that the weight of research coming out against or around ultra-processed foods strongly suggests to marginalize those in your diet. Doesn't mean you have to eliminate them, but make them, just an occasional thing that you do. Hey, I love potato chips. I just try not to have them around. If they're around, I'm going to eat them, and I'm going to survive because I try to limit my consumption of them.
My advice to you would be to have them in small packages.
Yes. Don't get a giant. If I get a giant package, I'm going to make it disappear. Right. If I get a tiny package, I'll make it disappear and I'll probably be fine.
Yeah. Small packages. And if you're somebody who cannot stop eating them and that, the new term, I love the new term food noise that's come out of the GLP-1 literature. I really like it. If you've got a food that's really noisy and is saying, eat me, eat me, eat me, you just don't have it in the house.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Well, I guess, that leads to the question, ultra processed foods are the one big hot topic in your field. And the other one is the GLP drugs.
Mhm.
We have to have the Marion Nestle take on the GLP drugs.
Well, I think it's too early to know. People have only been taking them for 2 or 3 years, and we don't know how long people stay on the drugs. We don't know what happens when people come off the drugs. I mean, we have early ideas about that, but we don't really know. And we don't really know how much of a barrier the cost and side effects are going to end up being. The research on them shows them to be phenomenally beneficial for a range of conditions that's just breathtaking. But on the other hand, the dropout rate is enormous because of the cost and because of the side effects, which nobody wants to talk about. But I ask everybody who's taking them, what are your side effects? And I would find the side effects hard to live with. One of the side effects is you just don't enjoy food anymore.
Right.
That seems like a heartbreaking loss of pleasure to a foodie like me.
Yeah. But I've also heard, I was reading I think it was a New York Times Magazine piece a while back about people who are, sort of really into an ultra processed diet, taking them and then losing pleasure for the ultra processed stuff, but actually finding it for fruits and vegetables. Is that something you've?
Yeah, that's amazing.
And if
No,
if that's true, it's really interesting. But what other side effects are you hearing about? Are they some unmentionable ones, or?
They're pretty unmentionable. I talked to one woman who was taking them for her diabetes, and she said, she's losing weight. Her doctor's really proud of her. Her symptoms are resolving. She wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning with projectile vomiting.
Oh, okay.
I thought, oh dear. You're going to stop taking it, aren't you? No. Okay, no wonder she's losing weight.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems very extreme to me. But people say, they feel nauseous, they have digestive difficulties. A lot of people get used to it and they don't mind it. I think it's very varied, but I just don't know what it's going to play out in long run. 2 or 3 years isn't long enough.
And GLP-1 is something that our bodies does produce, right?
Yes, I'm convinced that when you get old, you develop more of it because you can't eat as much.
Yeah.
Oh, and you want to eat more, and you want to eat more healthfully. I don't know. Yeah. It's kind of interesting, but I'm fascinated by the idea that people are rejecting junk food. They don't want sugar sweetened beverages. They don't want snacks. The food industry is really worried about it.
The food industry appears to be running scared about this and figuring out how to adjust. But
between that and ultra processed foods and inflation, they're in trouble.
Yeah. Well, I have learned as always, when I talk to you, I learn so much. Wonderful to have you on Unconfined podcast, and we hope to have you on again sometime. The thing is, you can talk about so many different issues that we will get you back on as a return guest.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and we will talk to you soon.